A brief history of plant life on Earth. If you want to talk about the history of plant life, you have to go back to the very beginnings of life itself. A little bubble deep in the ocean with a chemical code inside that we call DNA. And that chemical code in that first living cell was able to use materials and energy from the water around it to make more of itself. Now, each time the cell divided and made more of itself, there was a chance for the DNA to mutate and for a new kind of little cell to come out, eventually forming today's bacteria. But they tried out many different ways of life, many different things to eat, many different environments to live in. And at some point, one of these early cells figured out how to make its own food with the light of the sun through photosynthesis. All it needed was carbon dioxide, water, and light, and it could make its own food, making these first cyanobacteria, or blue-green bacteria, some of the best food sources for other cells around them. But in the process, they also released oxygen, and that oxygen became a major energy source for another kind of cell that developed from those earlier cells, which got bigger and more complex and developed a nucleus and became the eukaryotic cell that is the ancestor of all fungi, animals, and plants alive today. At some point, those cells were eating lots of the other little cells, eating those bacteria, but at one point, they must have eaten a cyanobacteria cell, or an early version of it, and instead of digesting it and killing it, they formed a symbiotic relationship, taking in that little cell as a part of itself, so that it could make food with light of the sun to feed the larger cell, while the larger cell protected it and got it to where it could get that light and other things it needed. That was our first plant cell. And with its thick cell wall that helped to protect it, it didn't need to move around for food, and it started to clump together. These first multicellular plants evolved into what we have today as the first naked to the eye, visible to the naked eye, plants. Now, these plants, which today we call algae, or the descendants today, have developed in all kinds of different ways. Evolution has never stopped. They've never stopped evolving. And they learned to spread their cells out to get more energy from the sun. And they even learned to make little air bubbles to keep themselves up to the top of the water. But they were bound to the water. They never developed true roots or leaves or stems. But at some point, these algae, which were so successful, they took over almost all of the water on Earth. At some point, they would have met the shore. And through continuing mutations and new ways of living, at some point, they were able to come ashore. And the descendants of these are today's moss and similar plants. Now, moss were able to live outside the water, but they weren't able to dig down into the ground to find water. They needed that water source close. All they had was a little, what we call rhizome, running along the bottom, a little early stem that had little root hairs coming down and attaching to the ground, and tiny little micro leaves poking up to catch the sun. But the moss was very limited. Its dense little clumps could hold on to water for a while, but it was very dependent on certain environments to survive, until it got a little taller and it developed the first true stem with a tube that we call xylem, pulling the water up from the ground so that the plant could get taller. And we call some of these plants the ferns today. And they were able to develop a leaf that was larger and could be reached higher up into the air and catch even more sun. Now, getting taller was a helpful trait because it would get you the sun that taller plants might block out. But to really get tall, plants had to do something else with their stem. they had to develop a woody stem with secondary growth that could allow it to grow outward into the giant trees we know today. But those early plants, those ferns and horsetails, they had a problem. They reproduced like the plants before them, like the moss, through spores. And now these spores can be found on the leaves of many fern plants, on the undersides of the leaves. But in mosses, they poke up above and they shoot their spores off in all directions. A single little cell with the genetic information to bring a new plant, if the conditions were right. Now, if the conditions were wrong, if the water and sunlight weren't available soon enough, that cell would die. And so along with the creation of woody stems, plants did something else. They packed up their little plant embryo with some water and nutrients and a hard shell that would keep those inside even in times of drought, so that they could last for years as seeds until finally the conditions were right and they could sprout. And here is a seed that came from my own kitchen. Because we eat these seeds all the time. We call them beans and rice and corn and wheat. These seeds could survive for a long time and then, when the conditions are right, grow. But they required something new. Pollen had to get from one plant to eggs on another plant in order to produce that seed. Now, the earlier seeded plants we call gymnosperms, which means naked seeds, like today's conifers. They relied on the wind and other natural forces to make that process happen, to get that pollen there. But at some point, one of these plants produced something a little different. It had its pollen set in a way where insects could get to it, and in eating the pollen of one plant and moving to another plant of the same species, they carried that nutritious pollen with them. Some of it they ate, some of it clung to their bodies, and it fertilized the egg on the other plant. Now, this was such a successful way of producing a seed, of getting that pollen using the help of a pollinating insect or other animal, that those plants survived and thrived, and they got better and better at attracting those insects until we had today's flowers. And with a pollinated egg, a fertilized egg, they could wrap a casing around their seed and produce a fruit. And that is where we get today's angiosperms, which means essentially seed in a case. And that is a very brief and oversimplified history of life on Earth.